My aunt accidentally sent me a video of my family calling me a pathetic failure while I'd been paying for their bills for years. She should be grateful, they laughed. I stayed silent until the next payment was due. My name is Audrey. I'm 34. 3 weeks ago, my aunt sent me a video by mistake. No caption, just a clip from a dinner I'd missed. I pressed play. My family was laughing. My brother Wade stood up, mimicking me hunched over a calculator. Pathetic failure, he said. Good at adding up everyone else's money. My mother, Lorraine, waved a hand to settle the table. She should be grateful. At least the money gives her something to feel useful about. The whole table roared. I didn't cry. I opened my ledger instead. For 6 years, I'd paid for everything. The mortgage on my mother's house, bought in my name after my father died, because none of them could qualify. Wade's truck, Megan's rent, my niece and nephew's tuition. Every transfer, every month, silent and on time. I'd never added it up. That night, I finally did. The number was bigger than I feared. Big enough to buy the house twice over. Big enough to be a retirement I never got to have. I didn't cry about the money. I cried about the time. 6 years of Fridays I said no to. Then I wiped my face and got to work. I drove out to Aunt Carol's. She admitted she'd seen my name pop up after she hit send and hadn't taken it back. I should have stopped them years ago, she said. I didn't want to be the next one they laughed at. That's when I understood. Nobody at that table would ever protect me. I'd have to do it myself. I pulled the closing documents from 6 years ago. The deed, the mortgage note, my name on every page. The house they called Mom's house, the one they'd laughed at me under. It was mine. Completely, legally, mine. I tested the water first, paid Megan's rent 3 days late, on purpose. My mother called within the hour, not Megan. My mother. The whole family's talking about how cold you've gotten, she snapped. Money was never the problem with you, Audrey. Your attitude is. 3 days late, and I was suddenly the villain of a 6-year story I'd been quietly financing. So I made a plan. 4 parts. I wrote them down so I wouldn't lose my nerve. 1. Sign the house back to my mother. Mortgage and all. 2. Every payment stops on the 1st. 3. Hand each of them an envelope with the full record. Every dollar, every date, no rounding, no commentary. 4. I would not argue. I'd say my piece and walk out the door. The 1st of the month landed on my mother's 60th birthday party. I let the calendar do the poetry for me. The night before, I sat at my kitchen table and sealed 4 manila envelopes. My hand didn't shake once. The church hall was packed the next evening. Sheet cake. A banner that said 60 and fabulous. My mother in a new dress, telling anyone who'd listen how she'd held this family together since my father died. She tapped her glass. I think my daughter wants to say a few words, she announced, glowing. She's good at taking care of things. The room applauded. They were waiting for a thank you speech. I stood up. I didn't have a glass in my hand. I had 4 envelopes, and I'd spent 3 weeks deciding exactly what I was going to put in front of everyone before I sat back down. I picked up the first one. My mother's name was written across the front in my own steady hand. Mom, I said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, this is for you. I started walking toward her, and the room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet right before something happens that people will talk about for years. I could hear the ice machine behind the buffet table. I could hear somebody's chair creak. I set the envelope down in front of her plate next to the untouched cake, and I didn't sit back down. I stood there and let her look at it. What is this? She said. Not really a question, more a warning. It's every payment I've made since Dad died, I said. Dates, amounts, what it was for. It's all there. Read it whenever you want. Tonight, next week, never. It doesn't matter to me anymore. Wade laughed first, the way he always did when he was uncomfortable. A short bark that meant nothing was actually funny. Real classy, Audrey. Her birthday. I picked tonight on purpose, I said. I heard my own voice and it sounded steadier than I felt, which was its own small miracle. Because I wanted everyone who's ever laughed about how useful I am to hear this in the same room, at the same time, so nobody could tell it differently later. My mother's hand was flat on the envelope, not opening it, like she could keep whatever was inside from being true by refusing to let air touch it. You're embarrassing yourself, she said quietly, the kind of quiet that was really meant to carry. I know how this looks, I said. I've had 3 weeks to think about how this looks, and I decided I didn't care anymore. I turned and handed the second envelope to Wade, who took it like it might be hot. The third went to Megan, my sister, who had gone very pale and very still, the cheerful flush from the wine draining right out of her. The 4th I set on the gift table, addressed to no one, because Aunt Carol had asked me not to hand it to her directly in front of everyone, and I'd respected that. The house is Mom's again, I said. I signed the transfer paperwork Tuesday. It'll record with the county in a few weeks. The mortgage goes back to being her responsibility starting the 1st of next month. I'm not paying it anymore. I'm not paying Wade's truck note anymore. I'm not paying Megan's rent anymore. I'm not covering Dylan and Ava's tuition anymore. I looked at my niece and nephew's empty seats. They were at a different table, mercifully too young to fully track what was happening. I love those kids. That's not about them. It's about everyone at this table deciding, apparently over dinner without me there, that I was pathetic for doing it. That video wasn't supposed to Aunt Carol started and stopped herself because there was no good end to that sentence. I know it wasn't supposed to reach me, I said, but it did, and I've had 3 weeks with it now, so. I shrugged, and the shrug cost me more than anything I'd said out loud. Happy birthday, Mom. I walked out of the church hall into a parking lot lit orange by one flickering sodium light, and I did not look back to see who followed, because I already knew the answer would hurt worse than not knowing. My phone started buzzing before I'd even gotten my seatbelt on. 14 missed calls by the time I got home, mostly from my mother, 2 from Wade, 1 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Megan calling from her landlord's apartment because her phone was dead and she was, in her words, losing my mind. I didn't answer any of them that night. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and I let myself shake for exactly 20 minutes, the way you'd let a fever run its course, and then I got up and made tea and went to bed. I want to be honest about what I felt the next morning, because it wasn't triumph. It was closer to grief, the specific grief of realizing a story you'd been telling yourself for 6 years, the one where you were the responsible one, the glue, the one who made sacrifices because that's what family does, had never once been shared by the people you were sacrificing for. To them, I hadn't been the glue. I'd been the ATM with a pulse, and apparently a personality flaw worth mocking over dinner rolls. The first loop had already happened, months before the video, though I hadn't recognized it as a loop at the time. It was just Wade asking, offhand over Thanksgiving, whether I ever thought about actually dating somebody instead of doing the family accountant thing forever. I remember laughing it off. I told myself he didn't mean anything by it, that Wade said dumb things when he'd had 2 beers, that it wasn't worth a fight over green bean casserole. That was the rationalization. The evidence that the rationalization was wrong came 3 weeks later, when I noticed Megan had stopped thanking me for the rent transfers. Not gradually, but abruptly, like a switch had flipped, like gratitude had become optional once it became routine. My stomach had dropped a little at that. A small cold drop I didn't examine too closely. And I'd tried to fix it by being warmer, by calling more, by sending Dylan a birthday gift that cost more than I'd meant to spend, thinking maybe if I gave more visibly they'd remember I was a person and not a subscription service. It didn't work. It never occurred to me that it wouldn't. The second loop came at Easter, when my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd told her book club I did something in finance, which was both wrong and telling. I ran the billing department for a mid-sized orthodontics practice, a solid, unglamorous job I was good at and didn't hate, but apparently even that had been quietly downgraded into a punchline she could deploy without me in the room. I told myself she just didn't understand what I did, that it wasn't malicious, just careless. The evidence against that came when I overheard her on the phone with Carol a few weeks later. I'd stopped in the kitchen to grab a water glass and she hadn't noticed me, describing me as content to just handle things, in a tone that made content sound like a diagnosis. My hands had gone cold around the glass. I put it back in the cabinet without filling it and left early, telling everyone I had a headache, which by then was not exactly a lie. The third loop was the truck. Wade had wrecked his old one, not badly, just enough that it wasn't worth fixing. And the ask had come to me sideways, through my mother, the way asks in my family always came sideways, so that nobody had to actually look me in the eye and request money. Wade's in a bind, she'd said. You know how he gets when he's stressed? I paid for the truck. I told myself it was temporary, a bridge, that Wade would pay me back once he got back on his feet at the warehouse. And for a while, I even believed it. The evidence that I was wrong arrived in the form of Wade posting a photo of the truck on social media with the caption, "Finally treated myself." No mention of who'd actually done the treating. 41 likes, 3 of them from people who worked with me. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. That excuse was getting thinner every time I reached for it, like a coin worn smooth from too much handling. There was a loop between those two that I almost forgot to count, because at the time it felt too small to matter. It was a Sunday in January, and my mother asked me, over the phone, whether I'd thought any more about adding her to my checking account just for emergencies, in case something happens to you. I told myself it was reasonable. I was the only one with steady income, and emergencies did happen, and maybe this was just her being practical for once instead of careless. That was the rationalization. And I actually sat with it for almost 2 weeks, drafting language for a limited power of attorney with a paralegal friend from work before I let it go cold on my desk. The evidence that undid the rationalization came when I mentioned, in passing, to Megan that I was thinking about it, and Megan laughed, not cruelly, just reflexively, the laugh of someone repeating a joke she'd heard before, and said, "Oh, Mom already told us she was going to ask you that. Already told them, before she'd asked me." As if my answer had been assumed, my account already folded quietly into the family's shared expectations, and I was simply the last one being informed of a decision that had been made about my own money without me in the room. I didn't confront anyone about it. I told the paralegal friend I'd changed my mind, and I told myself the whole thing had just been an awkward misunderstanding, and I put it away in the same drawer where I kept every other thing I'd decided wasn't worth the fight. The fourth loop, the one that finally cracked something in me even before the video, was smaller and somehow worse. It was Megan's daughter's dance recital. back in February. I'd paid for the costume, the recital fees, the photo package, $600 give or take, and I'd driven 40 minutes in sleet to be there. And when the MC asked the audience to acknowledge the people who made tonight possible, my mother stood up in the row ahead of me and took a small bow, laughing, while I sat there with my coat still zipped and nobody turned around. I told myself it didn't matter, that the point was Ava had a good night, that I wasn't in it for credit. I almost believed that too, until I got home and cried in my car in my own driveway for 45 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And some quiet, exhausted part of me finally admitted that if I wasn't in it for credit, I was at least in it for basic acknowledgement that I existed as something other than a line item, and I wasn't even getting that. The video was the fifth loop, and it was the one I couldn't rationalize my way out of, because rationalizing requires some plausible alternative explanation, and there wasn't one. There was no context that made pathetic failure and she should be grateful mean something kinder than what they meant. That was the loop that broke the pattern instead of continuing it, because for the first time, I didn't try to fix it by giving more. I tried to fix it by finding out exactly what I'd been giving and to whom, and why, which is how, 4 days after the party, I found myself sitting across a conference table from Marisol Chen, a real estate attorney with 12 years in property and estate law, in an office 2 floors above a dry cleaner's on Ridgeline Avenue. I'd found her through a coworker whose divorce she'd handled cleanly, and within 10 minutes of our first call, she'd asked the only question that mattered. Is the house solely in your name, or is anyone else on the deed? Solely mine, I told her. My father's life insurance had covered the down payment, my credit had covered the mortgage, and my mother, whose credit had never recovered from a bankruptcy in her 30s that nobody in the family discussed, had simply lived there, rent-free for 6 years, while I paid every bill attached to it from 4 states away in spirit, if not in fact. Then you don't owe anyone an explanation for what you do with it, Marisol said, sliding a legal pad across the table. But if you want to transfer it to her, we do it clean. Quitclaim deed, she assumes the existing mortgage or refinances in her own name, and you get a written release of any future liability. I don't want you finding out in 3 years that your name's still attached to a loan on a house you don't live in and don't control. It took 2 appointments and 1 very tense phone call to a mortgage servicer to get the paperwork moving. Marisol found something in the original loan documents I hadn't clocked 6 years earlier, a due on transfer clause that meant the moment the deed changed hands, the lender could technically call the full loan balance due unless my mother qualified to assume it or refinance. She's going to have to actually go get approved, Marisol said, not unkindly, which means somebody's going to run her credit for the first time in what sounds like a long time. I remember feeling something sharp and unfamiliar at that. Not glee, exactly, but the recognition that reality was finally going to be allowed to speak for itself, after 6 years of me speaking for it on everyone's behalf. The second person I brought in was Raymond Tolliver, a CPA who specialized in family financial disputes, the kind of accountant, it turned out, who mostly worked for people going through ugly divorces or ugly inheritances, which was its own quiet commentary on where families like mine ended up. I gave him 6 years of bank statements, Venmo records, and canceled checks, and asked him to build me something clean, a document that couldn't be argued with. It took him 9 days. What came back was 11 pages, dated, itemized, categorized by recipient and purpose, with a running total at the bottom that made my chest go tight, even though I'd already done my own napkin math weeks before. $211,430 over 72 months. Raymond flagged something else I hadn't noticed. 3 payments Wade had claimed on a loan application of his own as gift, non-repayable, which was technically true. And also, I realized reading it, the first piece of paper in the whole mess where somebody in my family had put in writing, under penalty of fraud, that I had never expected repayment. I hadn't, but it stung differently to see it typed out by someone else, in someone else's handwriting, as a fact about my life that had been used and then filed away. The third person came later, and I hadn't planned for her at all. Dr. Priya Nair was a licensed marriage and family therapist I started seeing not because of a court order or anyone else's insistence, but because 2 weeks after the party, I woke up at 3 a.m. with my heart going so hard I thought something was actually wrong with it, and a friend from work suggested I talk to someone before it happened again. Dr. Nair had a soft, unhurried voice and a habit of repeating things back to me that I'd said too fast to really hear myself. "You said you tested the water," she said in our second session, "like you expected it to burn you." I hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right. I'd known, on some level, I hadn't let myself examine exactly what would happen if I was 3 days late on a single payment, because I'd been running that same experiment in smaller, quieter ways for years, and getting the same result every time. In a later session, she asked me why I'd chosen to hand the envelopes out in person, at the party, instead of mailing them or simply telling everyone privately over the phone. I'd never really examined that either. I told her the truth as it came to me. Some part of me needed a room full of witnesses, because for 6 years the only proof I'd ever had of my own usefulness was a number nobody else could see. I wanted, just once, for the truth to exist in a space where nobody could later claim they hadn't heard it clearly. She didn't tell me that was healthy or unhealthy. She just wrote something down and asked me how it had felt to finally be witnessed, and I didn't have a tidy answer for that one either. She didn't tell me what to do about the house or the money. She asked me every session some version of the same question: what would it cost you to keep going the way you were going? I didn't have a number for that one. Raymond could give me a number for the money. Nobody could give me a number for the version of myself that would have existed in another 6 years if I hadn't opened that video. The crisis came 19 days after the party, on a Thursday, and it came from 3 directions at once, which is the only way crises seem to arrive in a family like mine. The first direction was the mortgage servicer. My mother's assumption application had been denied. Her income from a part-time job at a fabric store wasn't enough to qualify on her own, and there was no cosigner, because the one person who might have cosigned had just handed her an envelope explaining exactly why she wouldn't be helping anymore. The servicer's letter, which Marisol forwarded to me because my name was still technically on file as the outgoing party of record, gave a 30-day window before they'd consider the loan in default. 30 days sounds generous until you watch 3 weeks of it disappear into voicemail and hallway pacing. The second direction was Wade, who showed up at my apartment unannounced at 8:40 on that same Thursday night, pounding on the door hard enough that my neighbor cracked hers open to check. He wasn't drunk, which somehow made it worse. I could have discounted drunk. He stood in my hallway in his work jacket and told me, voice cracking in a way I'd never heard from him, that the truck payment I'd stopped covering had triggered a repossession notice, that he'd lose his job at the warehouse without a way to get there, that I was punishing everybody for one stupid dinner. It wasn't one dinner, I said. It was 6 years, and one dinner is just the part I finally saw. So what, I lose my job over a joke? You lose your job because you bought a truck you couldn't afford and let me quietly pay the difference for 2 years without ever once mentioning it to me directly, I said. That's not a joke catching up with you. That's math. He didn't have an answer for that, which was somehow worse than if he'd yelled. He just stood there in the hallway light, jaw working, and for a second I saw something that might have been shame trying to surface through 6 years of not needing to feel it. Then it passed, and his face went hard again, and he said the thing that stuck with me longest. You always thought you were better than us for handling it. Now you get to feel superior about not handling it either. I stood in my own doorway and felt my hands go cold the way they had in my mother's kitchen months earlier, except this time I didn't reach for the water glass. I told him I was sorry the truck was in trouble and that I wasn't going to fix it, and I shut the door while he was still talking, and I sat on the other side of it on the floor of my own hallway for a long time, listening to him not leave. The third direction was Megan, who didn't come to my door. She called, sobbing, saying her landlord had started eviction proceedings after 2 missed payments, that she had nowhere to take the kids, that I'd always been the strong one, and she needed me to be strong now. I had exactly one night to decide whether the story I was building for myself, the one where I stopped being the family's silent infrastructure, could survive contact with a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old possibly losing their apartment because of a decision I'd made at their grandmother's birthday party. My hands actually shook holding the phone. I remember staring at my kitchen table, at the same spot where I'd sealed the envelopes 3 weeks earlier, and understanding that this was the moment the whole plan had been building toward, without my fully admitting it. Not the speech, not the deed transfer, but this exact 3-way pressure test, arriving all at once, asking whether I meant it or whether I'd just wanted to feel, for one dramatic night, like I mattered. I called Marisol first, because she was the only voice in my life at that point who wasn't asking me for something. She told me the truth plainly. I could legally do nothing further and be entirely within my rights, or I could choose to help Megan specifically, separate from the larger decision, without reopening anything with my mother or Wade. You're allowed to draw the line anywhere you want, she said. It doesn't have to be all or nothing just because that's how they're presenting it to you. That sentence did more for me that night than anything else anyone said. I didn't save the truck. I let it go, and Wade lost his warehouse job 11 days later, and found a worse one within 3 weeks that paid less and had no benefits. And that consequence sits on me still, some nights. Even though I know intellectually it was his name on that loan, not mine, and his choice to buy a truck he couldn't actually afford and let someone else quietly cover the gap for 2 years. I did help Megan, but not the way she asked. I didn't pay her rent again. Instead, I called a tenants' rights clinic connected to the county courthouse and got her an appointment with a housing attorney who worked pro bono for cases involving young kids. And I paid, one time, for a security deposit on a smaller 2-bedroom across town that her actual income could support without me. $680, the last dollar amount I'd add to a ledger that already had $211,000 on it. I told her, and I meant it, that this was the last transfer she'd ever get from me, and that I loved Dylan and Ava enough to make sure they had a home, and not enough anymore to make sure their mother never had to be an adult about money. My mother's house went into a short sale 6 weeks later. I didn't stop it, and I didn't help it happen either. I simply stayed out of it entirely, the way you stay out of weather. Marisol confirmed the release of liability had gone through cleanly before any of it, so none of it touched my credit, my name, or my future. My mother moved into a one-bedroom apartment across town, the kind with beige carpet and a parking spot she has to pay extra for, and Aunt Carol told me, the one time we spoke after all of it settled, that my mother had cried for 3 days straight and then, on the 4th day, gotten a second part-time job without anyone asking her to. The truth came out publicly in the smallest, least cinematic way possible. Not an explosion, just a slow leak, the way truth usually spreads in families, through cousins and group chats, and one very direct conversation Aunt Carol finally had with the rest of them, laying out, in her words, exactly how long this had been going on, and exactly how long we all pretended not to notice. Carol told me about that conversation weeks later, over coffee, the first time we'd sat down together since the deed transfer went through. She said my mother had tried, at first, to reframe the whole thing as me being cold, as some sudden personality shift nobody had seen coming, and Carol had stopped her mid-sentence and asked, in front of everyone, whether anyone at that table could actually name one thing Audrey had ever asked for in return over 6 years. Nobody could. Not one thing. Carol said the silence that followed lasted longer than any silence she'd sat through at a family gathering in 30 years, and that Wade left the room before it broke. I hadn't asked her to defend me. She said she did it because she'd spent 6 years watching and saying nothing, and she'd decided that debt was hers to settle, not mine. Wade texted me once, months later, 4 words, "I get it now." I didn't answer. I'm not angry anymore, not really, but I've stopped believing that understanding, arriving that late, owes me anything in return. I still see Dylan and Ava. Megan and I speak carefully, about twice a month, mostly about the kids, and there's a wariness in it now that wasn't there before, which I've made peace with, because wariness is at least honest. My mother and I haven't spoken since the party. I don't know if we ever will again, and some nights that fact still knocks the wind out of me, and other nights I sleep straight through until my alarm, which never used to happen when I was carrying all of them. Dr. Nair asked me, in our last session, what I'd tell myself the night I first pressed play on that video, if I could go back. I told her I wouldn't change anything about what I did after. I'd just tell myself it wasn't going to feel like winning. It didn't. It felt like finally being asked for the check. After 6 years of quietly paying everyone else's,